This is Ashley Eckstein, Ahsoka Tano from Star Wars The Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi with Dan Z.
Hello, friends, and welcome to Coffee with Kenobi. I'm your host, Dan Zehr, delighted to have a Star Wars conversation with you. Since May 2013, I've been committed to creating a positive, family-friendly, spoiler-free place for our Star Wars community. Imagine walking into your favorite coffee shop and joining a lively discussion about Star Wars films, Disney Plus live action, animation, books, comics, collectibles, or Star Wars experiences at the Disney theme parks. I want to bring that sense of community to this podcast, my website, special events, live video experiences, email newsletter, and more. Join our Star Wars community at coffeewithkenobi.com and be part of something special. Thank you to the official travel partner of Coffee with Kenobi, MEI and Mousefan Travel. Check out coffeewithkenobi.com/mousefan-travel for a no-cost, no-obligation quote and let them know Coffee with Kenobi and Dan Zehr sent you. And while you're on Mousefan Travel's website, be sure to check out the Coffee with Kenobi Mousefan Travel Disney Wish Cruise. We are going on the Disney Wish June 16th to the 20th. It is the only cruise line that has a Star Wars experience on it. It is so much fun. I cannot wait to bring you along with me. So check out that information at coffeewithkenobi.com/DisneyWish for your no-cost, no-obligation quote. On today's show, Tom Hoeler joins me for part 2 of our conversation this week. We talk all about Star Wars: The Mask of Fear and really break down the makings of this brand new, exciting book. And stay tuned at the end of today's episode for a major announcement. So pull up a chair, grab your favorite coffee mug, and have some coffee with Kenobi. There's a new series in the world of Star Wars novels, as of course you are very well aware of.
Yeah.
Star Wars: The Mask of Fear, Reign of the Empire by Alexander Freed. What can you share about the idea for how this book came to fruition?
Sure. Well, I can also share that you and I are recording this at 9 p.m. the day before, because it's like 3 hours away from being on sale, which is really cool. I'm like,
it's so cool.
This is one of those funny moments in that I spend so much time working on books, and obviously books are in development for such a long time often that by the time we get to like the day before, it both simultaneously feels like I've been thinking about and talking about this book for years, which is partially true, but then also simultaneously feels like we like announced the book publicly yesterday. It's this very weird sense of like all the time has passed and no time has passed. But this series, this first book in this series, because it is a series, it's the start of a trilogy, came about in large part because we got really influenced and excited about the storytelling possibilities in the dark times, in the Imperial era, and particularly the kinds of things we saw in stuff like Andor. And in fact, we watched Andor, and then the team was sitting down, we were talking, we were like, this is the most ridiculous thing to say ever. Like we all knew in the moment. I want everyone to understand what I'm about to say is ridiculous. We were all like, could we do that in a book? Which is just like, I mean, Andor it's incredible. It's this amazing, unbelievable achievement. And so we all knew and knew it. It's like ridiculous to say, well, yeah, let's just do that in a book as if you can. But we loved kind of creating that North Star for ourselves, to like that thing to reach for. Like it might be out of reach, but like let's reach for it. Let's build something that is looking at the period in the Imperial era and in the dark times and the eventual growth of the rebellion, that leads us to the original trilogy and the rise of all the great saga heroes that we all know and love. Let's find a way to look at that across the long arc of the 19 years between episode 3 and episode 4. And we took real inspiration from Andor, but we also took real inspiration from like all of that Imperial era storytelling, whether it's the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, Respawn's amazing Jedi video game series, the Bad Batch, obviously Revenge of the Sith, and like each one of them has like all these amazing stories and focuses. And one of the things that we really noticed about all of them is like you could kind of group them a little bit. Like the Bad Batch is very much about the way that the galaxy changes post episode 3 from a military perspective, right? We're seeing it through the eyes of military characters, the clones, and we see it's very much about, it's about many things, of course, but it's about the clones being changed over to the stormtroopers, the volunteer army that we all kind of know from. And then the Jedi games, obviously they touch on that a little bit, but the Jedi games and the Obi-Wan Kenobi show are kind of like the story of what happens to not the Force itself, but like what happens to like the Jedi and the Force and that side of the post-Order 66 imperial era. And in all those stories, we really recognized that there would be these elements and these moments and these pops of what's going on politically and socially in the galaxy. But we were like, and of course, Andor is very much about that. So we looked at it and we're like, there's a place for us to kind of dive really deep on that particular element of this era and build another story that can complement all of those other stories and help round out the tapestry of this time in Star Wars. And we really sunk on the idea of, and we can do something that we hadn't seen before, which is, why don't we start the series, which is where the Mask of Fear starts, not just in year one of the Empire, which, I mean, to go back to the Batman thing, Empire year one, Batman year, but not just in year one of the Empire, but why don't we do it like just a couple of weeks after Order 66? What does the galaxy look like when like they're still picking up the pieces on Coruscant after the battle that we see at the open of Red? They're still picking up wreckage, and the ink, the proverbial ink on on Order 66 and on the Declaration of the Empire is like not even dry. What does the galaxy look like then? And so that all of that was this like keen inspiration for wanting to build a really cool series that became what is Reign of the Empire and the Mask of Fear.
Right. And obviously we've had so many stories set during the reign of the Empire. It's my favorite era in Star Wars personally, but what makes this book different and how does it complement stories that have come before? Now you've sort of addressed this already, but there might be something else.
So yeah, part of it is you always want, obviously every Star Wars story overlaps and is in conversation with every other Star Wars story, right?
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Right. Like every single one. But what you always want to do, we always try to do it with every book. I know everybody who works on Star Wars that I talk to, this is like, we approach it, you approach it the same way of like, of course it's going to overlap. It's going to reflect other stories. It's going to be in conversation with them. It's going to lead up to them. It's going to come out, all those things. But you always want it to also have a reason to exist on its own, right? You never want it to just be duplicative because that's boring, and why do it, right? And so, yeah, part of it was, okay, let's get as close to episode 3 as we can. Let's really get as close into those first days and weeks after Order 66 as we can, because that's something we have not seen before. That's a kind of time that we've not seen with that level of specificity before. And let's also then build kind of very low to the ground. What I mean is not just like your epic heroes, but your ordinary people, your people who are ordinary, who become extraordinary, your, people who are in the wrong place at the wrong time. So naturally they became heroes, to quote Leia, sort of thing, that we saw in Andor. Let's do that. And let's pull that again back to the very beginning of this era. Because as we see in Andor, that's many, many, many years into the established empire, right? And then we know as Andor season 2, again, the trailer came out today, so this is a very timely conversation,
right?
We know they're pushing forward as we move towards the Rogue One and the New Hope era. And so seeing this very early period to set up a trilogy and a series, and then be able to carve out its space by saying, we're actually going to not just take a snapshot of one part of this 19 years. We are going to try to look at the totality of it. Not every one of the 19 years, but we're going to use this series to jump forward across that span of time and dive in at key and important moments. So we can really see people grow and change. And we can see the galaxy evolve and the circumstances that people exist in, the choices they make, and the growth, or I guess the movement towards an organized rebellion. We can see all of this on a kind of longer timeline than we usually do, which allows for some just really cool storytelling choices and gives you some tools to play with that normally you don't have, because a lot of books, a lot of stories in general, take place over a couple of weeks, a couple of months, maybe a year, and there's like a time jump. To be able to look at a trilogy and a series in that way was just like really challenging, but it was a challenge we all looked at. We were like, we got to try this. Like, we have to try this. And because we haven't done this before. And so, yeah, that is all a way of explaining like where and how it sits. And to give people insight into characters they know and love. Obviously, we're using characters that, again, overlap with stories like Andor. We're using Mon Mothma, Saw Gerrera, stories like Obi-Wan Kenobi. We're using Bail Organa. We're using Leia. She's obviously a very tiny little infant in book one because she's literally just been born. But using them, and again, putting them in places you haven't seen before, putting their relationships in circumstances you haven't seen before, exploring them not just as mythic heroes, but exploring them as people who have ideas and opinions and thoughts and make decisions, but people who are flawed, or people who, make choices about how to act given only the information available to them because they're not omniscient, right? And getting to do all of that is kind of what I think makes the series unique and allows it to fit into this very well-defined, very rich era, but hopefully have its own space that will feel complementary to all of that.
Right, because you want, of course, to complement the rich tapestry that it already exists, but you also want to capture new aspects and nuance that help you look at these characters in a way that will enrich your understanding of them, but also understanding of that story. And I think it taps in what we were talking about earlier with character. And without giving anything away, because the book comes out, by the time this comes out, the book will only been out for a day, 2 days. And we want people to enjoy it, and we don't spoil it on Coffee with Kenobi. Anyway, but I feel like this book really looks at the humanity in a lot of these characters. And I think that, as I said before, I say to my students all the time, that human element, that's the thing, because you may not relate to Perseus, fighting Medusa, or anything because I teach mythology classes. So we talk about all kinds of different cultures and stories in all parts of the world. But it's the characters we come back to are the ones we can relate to. And I feel like this book does that.
It definitely does. And it also does this fun thing that I don't know that every storyteller doesn't always get a chance to do this, but it does this fun thing where, you as a Star Wars reader or viewer or anything, you actually know these characters really well. And you know more about the galaxy and the world than they do. You have a lot of information you don't. And in many cases, where they end up. You know what Mon Mothma's, fate, at least through, what we have seen of her story, even all the way to Return of the Jedi. You know what happens to Bail Organa. You know what happens to Saw Gerrera. And knowing that actually gives the author this interesting tool set to be able to be like, well, I know what you know already, which means I can play around with your expectations. I can play around with your assumptions because you are ahead of the characters. I can tell you and teach you things about them that maybe you didn't realize might be true because even though you know where they end up, you also can just use that to build tension, to play off stakes and stuff because because you as an author know what's coming and you understand that the readers know it too, but the characters don't. And you can really mine that for some really incredible storytelling choices, and you can take your characters in a lot of cool places because eventually they have to snap back to the fate that everybody already knows they're on. But that fate is not a straight line. It doesn't have to be. It needs to be an unbroken line, as all good Shakespearean stories would tell us about fates and lines and things. Yes. It has to be unbroken, but it can, it doesn't have to be straight. It doesn't have to be a solid line, and I think that's a fun challenge, and I think that particularly the authors who come to work on the series with us, and Alexander Freed writing book one, I think that's one of the things that really appealed to them about working on it was being able to play around with okay, you think you know who Bail Organa is? Great. What can we explore about him that you maybe might not realize already, or that might buck against some assumptions you might have made about who Bail is or what he is. Bail's great, by the way.
Yes. And there's a character where, we meet him in Revenge of the Sith. Well, I guess you see him earlier, but you really get to know more about him in Revenge of the Sith as far as, but we're not talking about Hamlet here, right? In the movies, he's very just, kind of one-dimensional because that's not his story. But in a book like this, or in Bad Batch, or anything with Tales of the Jedi had some stuff with Bail in it too, I believe. You've got an opportunity to make a character that there's already foundational pieces and make them more well-rounded. And I love that because it can be a trick, as you said. More so with Luke, Han, and Leia, I guess, because they're so well established. But when you've already got an idea of them and you're bringing in more to the sandbox, you make a more grandiose castle, if you can work with my metaphor there.
That works perfectly. That works perfectly.
So let's talk about, again, you have to get Star Wars: The Mask of Fear, Reign of the Empire. It's great. You're going to love it.
we're still going
It's
to
a
talk
big,
about it a lot. Of
it's a
Coffee
big
with Kenobi.
chunky book. It's also a big
Yes.
chunky book. So if you need like a big
Yes.
book, you're like, I want to read a long book. Like it's nice and long. It's one to be, I think, sipped and savored maybe rather than binged.
Yes.
Certainly, if you want to, go for it. But I think it's a sip and savor.
I agree. And spring break's coming up. You're probably going on vacation somewhere, airplanes, in the car. It sounds like a great thing to take with you. Let's build on the story too. Like, is there a particular era in the Star Wars timeline that you gravitate towards both as a fan and as an editor? I mean, obviously you're a professional, you're going to do whatever, but are there certain ones that you find as kind of as an editor, you're like, oh yeah. And then as a fan, or is it possible to be a fan and still work in that? I know it is, but it's a lot different. Like I said earlier about teaching and then a love of books too. Sometimes they can run into each other.
It is possible, absolutely. And all this time, I'm still a big fan of Star Wars. I'm still as excited to like watch Andor season 2 as everyone else is, and as excited to play whatever new video game comes out or movie thing. And like I still am. I compartmentalize though, and I try to as much as I can, the things I personally deeply love about Star Wars or really prefer about Star Wars from the stories that I tell. And so there is not necessarily an era that I prefer to work in as an editor more than any other, because to me, it's like that. It's what I care more about is making sure that whatever era we're working in, whichever characters I get to pull out of the proverbial toy box and play with, or pull off your shelf rather, looking at your shelf finds you, like whichever characters we get to borrow for a few minutes, because we're obviously we don't own them. We're just custodians for a minute, and then we put them back. What I care more about is making sure that we're finding a story that exists for a reason, that has something to say. And I don't mean something to say necessarily in some like grand, like real world state. If there's things that we can reflect or say about the world, or explore about the human experience in the stories, that's great. But wanting to make sure that the story has a reason for being, that, as I said before, is not just duplicative of like, yeah, we've told that story 20 times, or these other 5 storytelling mediums have told that story. So like, why do we need to also tell that story in a book? Wanting a story that has a reason for being, and wanting a story that has a specific goal of saying something about a character or revealing something else about Star Wars, again, reflecting something about what it means to be a person, just a human being, and reflect that. As long as we're doing that, like as long as there's an intention there, that's what I care about building, and that's what I care about the most. The specifics of the eras or the characters, yes, there are certain eras or characters that I find maybe more interesting than others for one reason or another, but I really try to compartmentalize that from what I'm working on, because even if that's not, it's like, because for me at the end of the day, it's like, I know out there every time we make a book, there's someone for whom like this is the book they've been waiting their whole Star Wars life, right? Or this is the era that they absolutely adore, or this is the character that means more to them than any other, and that they want to know everything about. And so ultimately then when I'm working on one of these books and editing them, I'm not ever editing them for me. I'm editing them imagining the person who's going to love this the most, the person for whom this is the most important era and the most important character and the most important story. And I try to build the decisions that I make or suggest creatively or suggest in terms of edits, and try to build it around that framework as much as possible, which it's hard because obviously we're all people with like our own thoughts and feelings and opinions and things. But I try as much as I can to, at least when I'm making a suggestion that I know is a bit more based on personal preference than it's a bit more subjective than objective, to at least try to be as mindful about recognizing that. And I actually do build that sometimes into my editorial feedback, where I'll say, hey, author, like, I don't know. I just feel like it should be like this just because I like XYZ thing. Sometimes it's not even XYZ thing in Star Wars. Sometimes it's just XYZ thing in stories overall, right? Like, I happen to kind of like this trope a little bit. This is just one of my jams. So it would be cool if we could lean into this bit more. But I always try to preface that in my feedback as like, this is a subjective edit that I make, or editorial suggestion I'm making, rather than it's weird to say objective one, because
I know what you mean.
that's not really a thing, but you know what I mean? Instead of one where I'm building a rationale based on, clarity or cohesion or in-world consistency or logic. Like, so I try to at least balance and recognize those things. That way, even if we do decide to do a thing, even if an author decides to take a piece of editorial advice from me that is a little more subjective based, that we're sort of doing that with eyes open. And of course, I try to then be mindful to not just do that constantly.
Right.
Well, every once in a while, I'll grab a line of dialogue and be like, could we just make it like this? Or something like that. Some tiny little treat for me, the edit. That's the way I like to look at it.
Absolutely. Well, so, as we've been saying, I'm a teacher. I teach writing, I teach mythology, I have a dual credit college class. And one of the biggest challenges, and also one of the biggest rewards, is feedback. For me, it's giving students feedback, trying to, most of my stuff is academic writing, right? Naturally. And hearing you talk and knowing what goes into being an editor. I mean, not as an editor myself, but, I edit my own stuff. I edit student stuff. But there's a difference there. But editors and teachers are quite similar. Did you ever consider working as a teacher?
I have worked as a teacher.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
The answer is that.
So I have worked as a teacher. I worked as a teacher a bit when I was in graduate school.
Okay.
I worked as when I was in graduate school, I worked as a TA for undergrads and did a little bit of fill-in teaching for a couple of classes when I was a TA in graduate school, which was cool. And then I worked a bit as a long-term substitute for high school and middle school for a couple of years while I was post-grad school, while I was trying to get into publishing. That was one of the things that I did, among the many other freelance and other things that I did to get by, is I was a long-term substitute. So, I'd come in when a teacher, teacher has to get like a shoulder surgery. They're going to be out for 3 weeks. And, you can show the video, you can watch the Netflix show for a couple of days, but if the teacher's going to be out that long, you do need to actually do some curriculum, right? You can't fall behind that much, particularly with school. So I would come in and do 3 weeks for an English teacher or a history teacher. Actually did a couple weeks for a business teacher, because again, I have that background too. But I would come in and do these long-term roles for high school and middle school and AP classes. And I loved it. I've always loved teaching. To me, teaching is something that I adore in all sorts of things. I love teaching board games. Teaching board games to me is almost as fun as playing board games. But I love teaching things. And I have thought about being a teacher, and I have thought about long term at some point doing some more formal teaching, whether that's try to do something, at the college level, in an adjunct sort of way for teaching class about publishing or something like that. Or at some point, maybe going back and, being a substitute teacher or doing some other teaching at some point. I've thought about it a lot. And I would love to do it. Any time I get a chance to do any teaching, even within my job, mentoring the junior editors on our team or the junior staff on that team, one of the things I love is when we hire a new person, I love being the person who's hey, come hang out with me for an afternoon. I'm going to teach you how to use all our systems, which are the most boring things in the world. And, they're finicky and whatever. But for whatever reason, I'm just I love teaching our contract system. Here's how you build a contract. It's really annoying, but here's how you do it, just because it's a quirky system. So no, I love teaching. And I totally agree with you about the overlap between being a teacher and providing feedback to students or that relationship between a student and a teacher, and the relationship between an editor and a writer, and the ways those lines of communication and the things that you're communicating and the way that you have to communicate, the way that those things overlap. I totally jive with that. But yes, +1 to teaching.
This makes me so happy. Boy, you and I are going to have one heck of a coffee conversation one of these days at a celebration. Gosh, I could go so many places with that. I'm actually working on a second master's right now. This is my first master's is in education, not administration. I just wanted to learn my craft. But this one I'm working on now is in creative writing, because I feel like that was something I wanted to learn more about that wasn't research based, at least not the same way as academic writing. And the class I'm taking right now is about giving and receiving feedback in writing for student papers. And the things that you were just talking about, I could send you articles right now that hint on some of the things that you are saying. So someday we're going to have to revisit this.
This is good.
I'm probably a bad influence because I'll be pulling that education magnet your way for sure. So
no,
we'll
that's
talk.
good.
Yeah,
That's good.
It's so great. How about this? Because one of the great things you do on your Twitter account or X or whatever, is you're such a generous, gracious human being with advice and suggestions for people. Now, there are people listening right now that think, boy, I want to write a story. I want to write, whether it's Star Wars or whatever it is. I know what I would say to people, but I'm not an editor, right? What advice would you give to people who are saying, I want to find a career in writing and publishing myself?
Okay. You want to find a career.
A real small question, right?
Really,
it takes 10 seconds.
This is the softball of softballs. No, so the first thing I always would tell people is read. If you want to be a writer, go read. And read everything. Read the stuff. Read stuff that's really close to the kinds of things you might want to write. If you already know what you want to write, read the things that have nothing to do with what you want to write. Just read, because you learn. You learn everything basically by experience. But you will learn to be a better writer by reading good writing, by reading bad writing, by reading writing you enjoy, by reading writing you hate. Like, you will learn. You will absorb it. You will understand it. It will teach you things, and it will teach you about writing. In really important ways, and it will just give you more tools in your writing toolbox. Right, to have read things, even if they are the kinds of stories you never want to write, there are ways in which those stories were built. There are elements of the storytelling that are universal. It's just how you put the tools together, how you put the tools to work. So definitely read. Be a really intentional person in your life with having experiences, because that's actually where the stories come from, right? Even the most fantastic stories that have no grounding in the reality that we live in day to day, they are all based in something about the experience of living that author had, or the experience of living that author wished they could experience, or imagined, or had and lost, or whatever it is. And so being really intentional about the world around you, and about the people that you know, and the people that you interact with, and the things that you do, and really paying attention, because that's where your stories are. But the real kind of craft of it, and how to do it is, one, figure out what your goal is as a writer. And that's really key, because what your goal is as a writer will actually help define what your process should be as a writer. What I mean by that is, every time I meet someone who says they want to write, I would say, okay, well, what's your goal? Some people, their goal is, I want my book to be sold in every bookstore in the world. I want to be number one on the New York Times bestseller. I want to have a 10 film series of movies made out of my books.
Sure.
That's what you want. Awesome. Some people say, I just want to have a couple printed physical copies of a book that I can gift my friends at Christmas, or I can gift to a friend for their birthday, or I can hand to someone. Some people are anywhere in the middle, right? And that, obviously, there's an amazing gamut of any kinds of opportunities between self-publishing, traditional publishing, indie publishing, just print on demand, doing yourself, whatever it is. And I always tell people that, because to me, that should inform then your process around it. Because if you want that thing that is your, the most famous, most successful author in history, then your writing process has to become programmatic. And so you do that, the advice of you should write every day and write 1,000 words every day, that's probably more true for someone whose end goal is that first thing. But if your end goal is somewhere different, then writing every day and you have to write 1,000 words every day, even if it's bad, I don't know, that's not necessarily the right advice for you. That's just the right advice for a particular writer, given what they're trying to accomplish. And so finding that and understanding what your goal is, and being honest with yourself about it. And then guess what? It's totally cool to want to reach for the greatest, most successful thing ever. It's also totally cool to not. It's great. It's your journey. It's your story and your journey. It's your purpose. But really understanding that, I think will help you as a writer, not just figure out what steps might I have to take if I want to professionalize this, because again, certain parts of that journey you might have to go left versus going right. Understanding that, I think, will give you a real sense of direction. And one of the hardest things about writing is just how open-ended it is, right? It's just if you just don't ever write, or if if you're working towards writing, you're working through writing, but you don't really have an endpoint, or there's so many ways in which the writing process can just sprawl, and in good ways and in bad ways. And so trying to give yourself direction, I think, is really helpful. But then the last part is really important, which is find the story that only you can tell, and not in a way that like only you have ever told it. Cause we all know the saying about like, there are only 7 stories in the world, but to recognize that like the reason why your story is going to matter and the reason why anyone's going to want to read your story is because you wrote it. Because no one else in the world could write your version of that story, because no one else is you. No one else has that experience. No one else has that combination of things, luminous things that make us, right? And so even if you're writing, because I see so many writers who get frustrated, like, well, I'm writing, it's just like, oh, there's like 100 of these. Oh no, like a story that came out that's like kind of similar to what I was doing, or there's like 1 million of these stories or whatever. It's like, yeah, but yours doesn't exist yet. And that is what I think makes people want to really read a story. And what I think, even if people can't articulate it, probably makes them really connect to stories, is when they read a story that they realize was written with such intention because it's just so specific to the person who wrote, as opposed to a story that's written trying to be a very specific thing for like everybody, but it doesn't have any of the author's individual personality or their individual voice in it. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that I tell every writer that I work with, since I work largely in licensed publishing, where I'm bringing you into one of several established worlds that has obviously a style and a voice and tone and rules that we aren't going to break, because otherwise we're not working in that world anymore. Like, why would we break the rules, right? But anyway, one of the things I always tell every writer is like, hey, I brought you here not to write a Batman story, not to write a Star Wars story, not to write pick your choice. I've worked in a lot of different worlds. It's been very, very cool. I'd say I've not brought you here to write one of those. I've brought you here to write your version of that. I want John Jackson Miller's Batman story, right? Mm-hmm. I want Alexander Freed's Star Wars story. I could get any number of people to write these, but I want yours, because it's about making sure that the story that you're writing is reflective of you. And that, to me, is, I think, the biggest thing that catalyzes people forward towards actually completing stories, is they just put themselves into it such that you have to finish. You propel yourself to finishing, whether you're writing every day or you write once a week, or you write after you put the kids to bed, or like whatever it is, however it works for you. I don't know. There's a really rambling answer.
I know.
I want to now edit that whole answer in my head, but we're going to leave. That's fine.
Honestly, Tom, when I'm sitting there listening to this, I found it very inspiring. So I very much appreciate you sharing that. And I thought, well, gosh, you must have answered this question before, because that was a master class in sort of the nuts and bolts of what it means. Because there is, when we're having discussion in class, or when I'm interviewing people on a podcast or whatever, sometimes people will say, well, somebody already said that, somebody already answered that. And I would typically say, yes, but they aren't you. How would you answer it? And I would say 100 out of 100 times, it's going to be different, because we all bring our own proclivities, our biases, our experiences, our lives, and we put them on to either our story that we're telling or something we're writing down. And it makes it sing in a different way, because there's like a lyrical quality to the written word that is not something that I think I couldn't properly explain. Somebody far smarter than me could explain it. But there's something that kind of comes to life when you've got into sort of a rhythm, and it isn't one size fits all. There is, I think it really has to be, to me, if its story isn't first, then what are we doing here? The story has to be because that is what carries everything forward, because that does ultimately answer your why. Now I'm the one rambling, but it's very true. I tell students the same thing. It's ironic. I say, if you want to be a good writer, you got to read good writing. It's just like saying, watching Steph Curry or Michael Jordan say, boy, I want to be a professional basketball player. My youngest says that, and I'm like, all right, let's go practice. You got to do it. You got to do it. And you can't, I tell people, write the story that you want to read. What's the story that you think, boy, I really want to read this story. This will be a great story to read. And that, I think, is where you get the impetus for an idea, or germ of an idea, as Harrison Ford used to say when they were creating all these Indiana Jones scripts. Very, very cool.
You're right. You have to. Every author I've ever talked to, particularly a lot of professional authors, And when I say professional, I mean like that their job is being a writer.
Absolutely.
There's plenty of people who are professional authors who also actually have other careers and stuff.
Yes.
The publishing they do is a secondary thing that they do. So, but the people that I talk to who are like, what they do is they write. And every time they finish publishing a book, they have to have the next book ready because that is actually also their livelihood. They all tell me like every time they chased writing what they thought the publishing market wanted or they thought the reading market wanted, every single time that they tried chasing it, it usually didn't work out. Because either by the time they finished writing the thing the market wanted or the publishing industry wanted or this group of people wanted, by the time that book was actually ready, they had moved on. They didn't want that anymore. They wanted something else. And because you cannot make books in 5 seconds, like because books take time, take time to make, chasing that is just so incredibly difficult. Mm-hmm. And that every time it's worked out for them, it's actually been the time really when they've just turned inward and said, okay, I'm going to write what I want to read. Or I'm going to write that story that's burning a hole in my metaphorical pocket. Mm-hmm. And then I'll figure out I'll find the people who want to read that after I write. But I know that's the story I want to write. And once I have it, I can figure out the second problem. So yeah, that's largely that's really how it works in practice. It really doesn't work the other way.
Mm-hmm. Plus you can't, there's that things you can't control those things anyway.
Exactly.
So you might as well focus on what you can do. And that's just be your best and let things go where they might.
Listening to Coffee with Kenobi, you are with Dan Z, the podcast you're looking for. This is
Tom, I couldn't have loved this conversation anymore, my friend.
Oh, this was great. And I mean, we barely scratched the surface just in talking about stories, just talking about
it's
writing
true.
And editing
it's
and
true.
teaching. Oh my God, we could talk.
It's true. Well, I'm happy to have you on any time to talk about anything regarding
Sure.
story and storytelling because it's an absolute blast. I mentioned your X account earlier. Where can people reach out to you if they have any questions or just want to say hello?
Sure. If you want to say hello to me, I'm on both X and Blue Sky as Darth Internus, INTERNOUS. And always happy to answer questions about books, publishing, weird, why does the copyright page of my book look like this? Like weird publishing factoids that you want the answer to. I probably have wasted hours upon hours looking it up because I just get really curious about it. So always happy to answer questions, chat about books, geek out about stuff. As we talked about at the beginning, I've been a reader since I was really little. I've been part of reading fandoms and reading communities since I was little. And now that I get to do this professionally, like one of the things that I find so gratifying is like still getting to be a part of those communities and still getting to contribute to them and talk to people who care about it as much as I do. So definitely say hi. Don't be shy.
Definitely not. And make sure that if you haven't already done so, pre-order or go to your local bookstore and pick up Star Wars, The Mask of Fear, Reign of the Empire by Alexander Freed. Tom, thank you so much again for being on Coffee with Kenobi.
Thanks so much, Dan.
That's going to do it for this week's show. A big thank you to Tom for joining me for part 2. What a great guy. What a great conversation. I always like listening to creative people talk about their passions and what they love. And be sure to check out Star Wars The Mask of Fear, available wherever books are sold. All right, now let's get to the announcement. I don't want to make everybody nervous. Coffee with Kenobi is not going away. I know there's been some speculation about that. But here's the thing. I've been doing the show for 11 years without a break. And, I look at the calendar and I've got a little bit of time before Star Wars Celebration Japan, before Andor comes out. I'm going to take a little bit of a break. I will take about a little over a month off. I will be back the week of the 17th, which is Star Wars Celebration Japan. Then in the meantime, I'm going to rest, recalibrate, and think about the vision for Coffee with Kenobi. I've done so much with this show. I believe truly there is more to do, but I have an idea of how I want to modify things going forward. In fact, I'm probably going to send out some sort of a survey. So please look at that on the website. Once I make it, I'll post it on social media, certainly on the Facebook group, coffeewithkenobi.com/community. That's where you can go and fill out the survey. Again, I haven't made it yet, but I am going to work on it. And this is something I'm really looking forward to. And again, don't get me wrong. Nothing to be concerned about. The show's not going away. I just thought after 11 years, wouldn't it be nice, since I have time and I'm finishing up something pretty big in grad school, that I'm going to take a little bit of a break and come back refreshed, ready to go with a brand new pot of coffee for us all to share collectively. But that doesn't mean the show's going away. We'll certainly be on social media actively, and the website will be updated regularly as well. If you have any questions, you can always email me, danz@coffeewithkenobi.com. You can find Coffee with Kenobi all over social media, X, Instagram, Threads, Pinterest. Give the show a like on Facebook at facebook.com/coffeewithkenobi. Subscribe to Coffee with Kenobi's YouTube channel. And while you're doing all the Coffee with Kenobi things, be sure to take a few minutes to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. One thing that will not be taking a break is the CWK Alliance. Coffee with Kenobi is possible because of members of the CWK Alliance. That is our Patreon page where you can get exclusive access to CWK Pour-Over, a video and weekly podcast not heard anywhere else. Find out more at coffeewithkenobi.com/CWK Alliance. Thank you so much for joining me for a virtual cup of coffee. I appreciate your time and look forward to the next opportunity to discuss Star Wars with you. I will see you for coverage of Star Wars Celebration Japan the weekend of the 17th of April. I'm Dan Zehr, and I'm reminding you that this is the podcast you're looking for.
This podcast is not endorsed by the Walt Disney Company or Lucasfilm Limited. It is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. The official Star Wars website can be found at www.starwars.com. Star Wars, all names, sounds, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Disney and their respective trademark and copyright holders. All original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Coffee with Kenobi unless otherwise indicated.
This is the podcast you're looking for.
There's no one here.